This week we had the rest of our classmates present on deviance and crime in society. Although I didn't do a formal lecture, I just wanted to recap all of the information that the groups were able to cover for us. When we talk about deviance in sociology, what we're really talking about is the exploration of why we all violate norms. There's no judgment associated with the conversation, and we're taking a look at the difference between informal norm or informal deviance and formal deviance. A question that I would like to pose to you is, one of the things that we consider deviant in our society is graffiti. Another might be how a person dresses or presents. So, would graffiti on a sidewalk or the side of the building be considered deviant? And the answer is yes. Would orange hair and blue lipstick be considered deviant? The answer is yes. However, might a piece of how we consider someone engaging in deviant behavior be who is actually engaging in the deviant behavior? So if the graffiti that we see is actually created by a child, would that change whether or not we view graffiti as being deviant? Or if a girl is wearing orange hair and blue lipstick and we see a male dressed with colored hair and lipstick, would that, who's considered deviant at that point? Is the question I would like to pose to you all to think about. Because in reality, in society, who decides what's deviant impacts who receives the stigmas that are associated with deviant behavior. As we get older, we learn that our parents and teachers help specify what's deviant, and then later the laws define what's deviant to us. A second piece of the chapter specifically talked about the interrelationship between deviance and crime. And when we talk about deviance and its criminal aspects, I think it's important first to take a look at the non criminal ones. So, some types of deviance behavior that are non criminal include things such as suicide, lying, perhaps how we look at mental illness. And certainly we can see how stigmas are associated with each of those categories and many more. When we're looking at the criminal aspect of deviance, we have to be aware that there's multiple types of crime associated with deviant behavior. Most of us are largely concerned with street crimes, which includes the violent and property related crimes. But there's also hate crimes, white collar crimes, organizational crimes, cyber crimes. The list kind of goes on in this particular category. And it's important to note that oftentimes when we're talking about these different sorts of crimes, there are certain stereotypes and biases that come into place, and that's why it's so important to be aware of the research and data behind the actuality, or I'm sorry, the reality of the situation. Many times we'll use misperceptions of what reality is in order to further a particular bias or conversational point as it relates to stigmatizing certain marginalized groups in this particular arena. As always, we're going to take a look at the theoretical application of the four major theories that we look at or that we discuss every week as it relates to deviance and crime. So the first theory that we're going to talk about is functionalism. And in this theory, as it applies to deviance, what functionalists tend to say is that this is a normal part of society, and when deviance becomes dysfunctional, then it tends to create tension and insecurity. Within this perspective, it's believed that deviance helps to affirm cultural norms and values, and it does bolster the economy and trigger social change. Now, depending on where we're at during periods of rapid social structure, it's important to understand that social rules may break down, and this is when Durkheim's concept of anomie come in, as well as Merton's strain theory. The second theory that we talk about is conflict theory. And when we're looking at deviance as it relates to conflict theory, then one of the things that we want to talk about is how capitalism produces crime. And we believe this to be true, and as much as we can assert that something is in fact true in sociology, because the greed and self-interest that is present in our society tends to perpetuate deviance. And it does this by encouraging corporate crime. So if you remember, overall, conflict theory is all about what the have-nots are doing to help continue the system of oppression for the haves. And so in this way, deviance helps to create considerable social inequality for those living in a particular society. Now, a criticism of conflict theory is that it does exaggerate the importance of capitalism and downplay street crimes. It also ignores the fact that crime is actually functional for the society. When we take a look at feminist theory as it relates to deviance, what we're really looking at is the analysis of female offenders. And socialization tends to explain some of the gender gaps in the arrest rates. So, for instance, as compared to males, females have more responsibilities from an earlier age, they're supervised more closely, they're expected to behave in a different way. In the feminist perspective, we also have explanations for female victimization. And here, one of the groups really did a great job of highlighting the issues associated with the rape culture in our society. The last theory that we look at, of course, is symbolic interactionism. And the perspective on this theory as it relates to deviance is where we get into labeling theory and differential association theory. So with differential association theory, what we're talking about is that people learn deviance through interacting with one another, and the more closely linked they are with those people in their life, the more likely they're going to be to engage in the same type of behavior. Because as we all know, we are products of our socialization. With labeling theory, what we're talking about is society's reaction to behavior and how this impacts our ability to define ourselves or others as deviant. One last point I want to make before we wrap it up for this week. One of the groups posed a really great question, and that question was, why do gangs not fit with control theory? And when we look at social control, what we believe about this particular concept is that formal social control exists outside the individual. So, for instance, it's those rules that help guide our behavior, those laws that guide our behavior. Informal social control are the societal expectations that we learn in childhood. Now, when we look at control theory, that's what we're talking about when we say that deviant behavior decreases when people have strong social bonds with one another. So if we posit that people who engage in gangs actually begin participating in gangs because social and economic forces have not come together to teach them those informal and formal social control mechanisms that the rest of us have learned starting at a very early age, what I would suggest is that control theory actually does work for gangs, only it works for gangs after they become part of the gang. So because of the various economic and social forces that are at play that may uh, impact households where gangs have a larger presence. So for instance, they may be gang members are often coming from single parent households. They come from low income economic regions, which typically means that jobs are not available, so there is a struggle to be able to pay for basic needs. There's very little adult supervision around folks that initially get involved with gangs, and so because of this, young people are often looking for that guidance, that discipline that they are not able to tap into during a particular life development process. So because they aren't able to find it in some of those other arenas where many of us are, such as the home and the school environment, etc., they go looking for it. And when they find it in a gang environment. Now, once a person joins a gang, again, I would suggest that control theory actually does kick in because within a gang, there are certain sets of rules. There are very strong bonds created. And if you want to maintain membership to this particular sort of group, you have to follow the rules that are associated with that membership. So in that way, I kind of feel like the question posed was a trick question. I understand why it's perhaps not easy to answer. But I offer that up as just one way of perhaps looking at gangs, their purpose, and linking that to this theory of control. Okay, guys, that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to be moving into yet another topic, which is stratification. So, from here on out, what we're going to start to see is class is going to shift a little bit. I'm going to do a little less lecturing and I'm going to try to do more application. So, in that way, you might start to see our class look more like a flipped classroom, which means you're going to be largely responsible for learning the content. And when you come to class, we're going to work on applying the content. I'll talk more about that next week.